think we're moving over now to our presentation on sustainability and resilience from Dr. Rufus Howard. Rufus, of course, has been participating all day and adding a slightly different perspective to maybe what we see day in, day out. So look forward to your presentation, Rufus, and taking forward some of these ideas that you've already hinted at this morning.
Thank you, George. I think we're going to start with a presentation, and then we'll move on to a Q&A with a couple of guests, and then after that we'll move on to the roundtable, I believe. So if I pass back to Mion, we'll go straight into the presentation.
Thank you, Rufus.
Welcome to Sustainable Highways, Better, Greener and Faster. My name is Dr. Rufus Howard. I'm the Policy and Engagement Lead for Impact Assessment at the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. A little bit about IEMA. I'm going to play you a 90-second video which sort of gets across the purpose of the organisation.
The world is changing. So must we. Billions more want cheap commodities made from dwindling resources and harmful materials. Extreme weather events can disrupt supply chains. And new legislation means we must continually adapt. Climate change affects us all at some level. But to transform the world to sustainability, we need the right skills and knowledge in place. At IEMA, we bring people together, creating opportunities for innovation and growth. On the front line, we help people translate compliance with resources and toolboxes. We support people with skills gaps so they feel reassured everyone in the supply chain is aligned. We help plot career paths for people looking to gain experience and accreditations, and open up people to new ways of thinking, transforming productivity and competitiveness, cultivating connections around the world, and helping people get recognition for cutting-edge projects. With the urgent need to move towards a sustainable future, we need to stand together to mobilize and drive change, an alliance that can challenge norms, influence governments, drive innovation, and demonstrate that people can achieve measurable change on a global scale. IEMA. Together, transforming the world to sustainability. The world.
Hopefully that's given you an overview of who IEMA are. So what I'd like to do now is just give a brief definition of what I mean when I talk about sustainable highways. So I'm using a definition here from the United States Department of Transportation, Federal Highways Administration, and it is that sustainable highways should satisfy life cycle functional requirements of societal development and economic growth, whilst reducing negative impacts to the environment and consumption of natural resources. Some of these themes, such as life cycles, social, economic, environmental sustainability, I will return to throughout the presentation. A brief overview then of the presentation. I'm going to deliver it in three parts. I'm going to give an overview of policy around sustainability and highways. I'm then going to look at sustainability across the project lifecycle, and I'm going to finish with a few slides on the future of highways. So part one then, a policy overview. I'm going to start at the macro and work down to the more specific highways policies. At the top level, what is sustainability? Well, it's balancing the environmental, economic and social aspects of activities. The more famously known as people, planet and profit, and that's been discussed as the triple bottom line that businesses and organizations should be working to. Why should we care? Well, we have a triple crisis. We have social unrest, we have climate change, and we have a biodiversity crisis. This is a social, moral and ethical issue for people and organizations, but for those who are not particularly concerned with those aspects, there's pragmatic issues of concern here around security of food, security of energy supply, security in its own right, health, well-being, and prosperity are all impacted by these megatrends. We have the triple crisis, and then we have triple bottom line as a way of navigating ourselves through these headwinds. And that's about these three pillars of environmental, social, economic. And if we balance them in all of our activities, then we will have a sustainable society in the long term. Key aspect of sustainability that's current is they've been codified into Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. Over 180 governments have now signed up to these. These can be considered, in a way, a business plan for the planet. And the UK is obviously signed up to these, and some of the implementation methods are related to highways, which I'll come on to. Now, rather than going on myself about the Sustainable Development Goals, I do have a 90-second video on the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll now play. So as you can see, they're pretty comprehensive, and we need to implement them in the UK. So before I look at this SDG implementation in the UK, it's worth saying that sustainability is already at the heart of the UK planning system. So the National Planning Policy Framework sets its overall purpose as the achievement of sustainable development, which they define as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that National Planning Policy Framework sits above all the other planning policy, which are all set the requirement for all plans and policies to be helping with sustainable development. In terms of implementing the SDGs within the UK, the SDGs run from 2015 to 2030, following on from the Millennium Goals, which were 2000 to 2015. In July 2019, the government produced a corporate report outlining the current implementation or progress towards implementation of the SDGs. In it, they state that the UK government is committed again to sustainable development goals, and they see this as the most effective way to carry this out is by each government department, which would include the Department for Transport. So went through the goals, and there were three specifically mentioning transport within the corporate report on the implementation of the SDGs. So the first one, Goal 9, about building resilient infrastructure and sustainable industrialization, talks specifically about the Department for Transport working with local and regional and developed partners to meet regional and national ambitions. And those ambitions are set out in other documents. Some of the core documents where those ambitions are set out relating to transport and highways is in the Road Investment Strategy, covering 2020 to 2025, which I'll go through the highlights of in a moment. Then secondly, Goal 13, taking urgent action to combat climate change. The government recognises that we need an increasing number of electric vehicles and the infrastructure to support that on the highways. And secondly, they talk about their Road to Zero strategy to map out and enact that transition to a zero-emission transport sector. And again, I'll pick up on the highlights from the Road to Zero strategy in a moment. So finally, Goal 15, which is about protecting and restoring biodiversity and ecosystems has a general requirement to mainstream biodiversity net gain, which is not just mitigation of loss, but actual increase of biodiversity for developments when granting planning permission. And obviously that would then apply to any transport projects requiring planning. So looking at those specific documents that were set out then, the Road Investment Strategy 2, I'm just going to look at the sustainability aspects, but there's a vision for a greener network. Then it's broadly split into two sections with regard to sustainability, tackling climate change, and immediate improvements to the environment. Now, in terms of that overall mission for a greener network, the government report talks about the majority of vehicles being zero emission, with the benefits there to air quality and carbon, extensive and effective use of environmentally insensitive green infrastructure, enhancements to create roads that fit their surroundings, minimizing negative impacts and aligning to the natural built and historic environment of their place, and also mentions the softer state that should be well maintained and designed. Looking specifically then at the two aspects of tackling climate change and improving the environment now. Again, the report sets out that a third of all UK greenhouse gas emissions arising from transport, and therefore that's critical to our efforts to tackle climate change. And they set four key issues there in RIS2: decarbonisation of freight, developing UK as a leading hub for zero emission R&D and manufacturing, tackling congestion hotspots, and developing a world-beating network of rapid and high-powered charge points along the strategic road network. They go on to say that this is one of the most ambitious plans in the world that the UK has, and that it's going to end the sale of new conventional petrol and diesel cars by 2040, and furthermore they're consulting on bringing that forward to 2035 or faster, and that other plans that the government has, such as the government's clean air, clean growth and nitrogen dioxide strategies, also are relevant and have objectives for the transport sector. Looking at that Road to Zero document, the mission is to put the UK at the forefront and design of effectively the transition to zero emission vehicles, not just in the UK, but then exporting that expertise globally. They wish us to reduce emissions from vehicles on the roads, drive uptake of clean vehicles, reduce emissions from HGVs, develop best electrical vehicle infrastructure in the world, and support local action. So quite ambitious there. How this policy is going to get translated into reality is going to be through their Decarbonisation Plan, which, whilst not published, they have released a document setting out how they're going about it. And the Decarbonisation Plan talks about accelerating modal shift to public and active transport, decarbonisation of road vehicles, decarbonisation of our goods delivery systems, which I'll come on to a bit more in a bit, place-based solutions. Again, the UK is a hub for green transport technology and thereby reducing carbon in the global economy. It's set out some graphics here. I'm not going to read it in detail, but effectively these summarise this down into 6 points. We've got the modal shift to public transport. Effectively, this is about changing behaviours so that public transport and active travel is a first choice for daily activities, and that obviously will require a lot of work to make a reality. Decarbonisation of road vehicles. It's not just about the technology. There's a regulatory framework, the consumer base, market conditions, vehicle supply, energy system readiness, as in our wider grid. A lot of that needs to be strategically planned and delivered in tandem. Decarbonising how we get our goods. There's a lot of focus on the last mile deliveries, and how can we look at alternative technologies and methods through autonomous vehicles, drones, cycling, etc., to look at the future supply chain, particularly for consumer goods. They're also looking at place-based solutions. One of the potential pitfalls of any national plans is that you get a one-size-fits-all, and the reality of sustainable development is that it's very localized to what one technique that works in one place won't work in another. There needs to be bespoke solutions, and therefore place-based solutions and acknowledging that we need to use different tools in different locations at different times is key. Final 2 points for the roadmap: UK as a hub for green transport technology and innovation. I think this is a key point because we need to move away from thinking that the transition to a sustainable economy is a burden and see it as the opportunity that it is. All economies in the world will have to make this transition. And if the UK gets on the front foot and develops solutions, these can be exported both as services and products globally, bringing wealth and prosperity to the nation. Finally, reducing carbon. Obviously, this is we cannot solve global carbon issues just within the UK, but what we can do is form multilateral partnerships through the Paris Agreement and other international treaties. And we can hardly require other nations to rein in their carbon emissions if we ourselves have not reined in our own, and we need to be leading by example. So that with the tackling climate change aspects of the decarbonisation plans relating to transport. And now we turn our attention more to the traditional environment of sort of biodiversity, air quality, noise, etc. So the document RIS2 sets out 345 million Environment and Wellbeing Fund, and that's targeted at green infrastructure, location appropriate, operations, supporting cycling and public transport users, make better use of active and sustainable travel choices, and investment, increased spending on operation, maintenance and renewal of the network. But the key here being that that renewal is modern, fit for purpose, and only adding capacity where it's needed on the network. This also ties in with wider government policy, such as the Environment Bill and the government's 25-year Environment Plan, which is looking to embed environmental stewardship across the whole of government, moving away from mitigating damage to environmental net gain and a natural capital approach, where we're making the right choices on long-term decisions, considering the environment as an important and essential economic asset. And there's some 6 specific actions there around the improving environment set out in RIS2, which is reducing noise, biodiversity net gain, clean air, addressing severance issues, protecting ancient woodland and protected areas, and respecting built heritage. Importantly, these aspects are dealt with in the current system through the provision of strategic environmental assessment for plans and through environmental impact assessment for project level assessments. So although a lot of this policy is developed for transport, the mechanisms for delivery are actually pan project mechanisms such as EIA, which apply to both transport and other forms of infrastructure. So moving now on to that infrastructure and some of the more practical implementation of those policy objectives, we need to be looking at the whole life cycle of projects. So that's from programming and scheduling of multi-asset schemes through the planning and permission of individual schemes, through the construction, and then the operation and maintenance phase. And that project life cycle, it's important that sustainability is embedded throughout all of those aspects. It's not something that just needs to be considered at the programming stage. It needs to be carried through the design process, through the construction process, through environmental management plans, and then it needs to be embedded into an environmental management system during operation and maintenance so that those objectives are met at each of those stages. Furthermore, there is a PAN project cycle whereby the lessons learned and the information generated by an individual project needs to be fed back in to the programming to inform other and future projects. So starting with the strategic level, strategic environmental assessment is the tool we use to assess plans, policies and programs. So we need to be thinking that those sustainability aspects, which can be quite granular around noise, biodiversity, etc., are often only thought about at the project level. But the same principles need to be applied to investment decisions, technology choices, the procurement process, and the overall scheme appraisal. By the time you've decided that we're going to design and develop and send through planning, for example, an entirely new road asset, many of the sustainability options have already been closed off at that point. So therefore, it's important that there is a step before that where the strategic environmental considerations of all of the aspects that I mentioned in the policy section are applied to know whether the particular avenue being taken, whether that is new road or road resurfacing, is the right solution, or whether an alternative solution should be had. And that includes the strategic assessment of what proportion highways plays in the overall transport strategy, including rail, aviation, shipping, etc., in our national transport infrastructure. This is a slide I've actually taken from a university presentation in France, so the language is not spot on. But what I liked about it was it tried to relate transport infrastructure to that 3 pillars of sustainability Venn diagram I mentioned earlier. And I think it really nicely illustrates the complexities of a transport scheme. It's not just a case of where to put the road, how wide it is, what materials we're using. Got to consider climate, the full lifetime cost of the asset, price, safety, social impacts, land use, interactions, noise, clean air, habitats, etc., alongside public participation. So all of these aspects, which are a mixture of economic, social, and environmental, need to be considered holistically, and that's the role of strategic environmental assessment and, at the project level, environmental impact assessment. For environmental impact assessment, we have the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, which is used for the assessment and design of major highway infrastructure. And that has a suite of documents that can be used to aid in the assessment of those projects. However, importantly, going back to my earlier point, a lot of the opportunities for really embedding sustainability are in the design phase. So a particular document, GG 103, talks about the general requirements for embedding sustainable development in design. And I think it's critical that the engineers, architects, and project managers and the proponents of a scheme understand that sustainability is everyone's responsibility. And it's not a bolt-on activity that's given to, say, sustainability consultants after the design is quite well progressed. IEMA itself has been advocating integration of environment, sustainability, and design for many years. And there are 2 bits of guidance in particular worth drawing attention to: 2015, Shaping Quality Development, and 2016, Delivering Quality Development, where we developed guidance to show how the design process and the EIA process run alongside each other in an iterative process, informing the steps along the way. And furthermore, how in the delivering better quality development, the focus shouldn't be just on the assessment, but the delivery mechanism. How are we translating these design and impact assessment considerations into environmental management plans, environmental operation and maintenance manuals, etc., to make sure that those considerations, as I mentioned earlier, are carried throughout the life cycle of the project. IEMA has been advising on highways for some time, and a quite famous note here is the 1993 Guidelines for Environmental Assessment on Road Traffic, elements of which are still used today, actually. And that was a predecessor of IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Assessment, which became IEMA. And highways planning and environmental impact assessment are obviously closely entwined. It's not just about the assessment of impacts, as I said, it's the input to design, it's the development of mitigation enhancements, and also the public and stakeholder consultation process. IEMA has been giving advice on the EIA process more generically since its foundation. There's a few key documents here which sort of set the tone. In 2011, we did a review of environmental impact assessment across all sectors in 2011 and looked at opportunities and challenges. Facing some criticism about EIA becoming too burdensome, we looked at delivering proportionate EIA. That's a strategy we developed in 2017. We looked at how we could embrace digital and other techniques to make EIA more proportionate, more focused. We also respond to government consultations on EIA and planning, and in fact there are ongoing consultations now on further reforms to the planning system which we are engaging with. We also partnered with the Landscape Institute. We produced the Guidelines for Landscape and Visual Impact Assessment in partnership with the Landscape Institute, which are used on highways projects. It's on version 3 now. We provide guidance on climate change resilience and adaptation and the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions for EIA projects. We've just released a 2020 update to the climate change resilience document, and we're currently undertaking a GHG update document. So there'll be a 2021 version of greenhouse gas emissions for projects coming out soon. On the ecological side, we've been a champion of biodiversity net gain for many years, and it's now reaching the mainstream with the Environment Bill and upcoming legislation looking at integrating that across the planning system. For biodiversity net gain, IEMA proposed 10 principles, and these follow things such as the mitigation hierarchy, the ensuring measurement of net gain contribution, and a net gain legacy. These are important aspects to consider on all future highways projects. We also have traditional guidelines on things such as noise, health, materials and waste and impact assessment, all pertinent to transport projects. And our most recent activities have been focusing on digital impact assessment and the sort of digitization that most professional bodies and professions are going through. So earlier in 2020, we produced a primer for embracing innovation and digital working. You can see examples of that in practice through the sister document, Digital Impact Assessment in Practice. Many of the case studies there are large road schemes. If you want to look at them, you can go onto the IEMA Mott MacDonald digital engagement platform, where you can see videos of road schemes such as the, with examples such as the Stonehenge tunnel and the Thames crossing, looking at how consultancies and organisations are using digital tooling to improve practice for the assessment of transport projects. A lot of those documents I've shown you are actually for members of IEMA, although you can purchase them. Some of them are open access and some of them aren't. But alongside that, we do have an open access series called the Impact Assessment Outlook Journal, and we publish that quarterly with topics of interest, such as a recent one on cumulative effects assessment, which again is a key aspect for transport projects. So thinking about now the operation and maintenance phase, presuming the planning has gone ahead and permission has been granted, there's lots of aspects that need to continue through that life cycle. Monitoring is key. How do you know if those predictions were correct? How do we know if the mitigation measures have been successful in mitigating the adverse impacts identified within the EIA process? Adaptive management is key here because the situation on the ground changes, baseline information, new things come along, policies change, and projects need to adapt. You can get emergency works from flooding or fire, etc., which will need to consider environmental issues, renovations, decommissioning. Environmental management systems are key here, along with auditing. I've put down enforcement there for highways authorities that are commissioning projects. They will also potentially be responsible for enforcement through the local authority. And there's needs to be enforcement to ensure that contractors and private developers have actually carried out the mitigations and met the conditions that were set out within their planning permissions. So finally then, I want to talk about very briefly the future of highways. So the phrase VUCA that's been used, particularly in business circles, which talks about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So the difference between now and the past, there's always been these aspects in business. However, it's the speed of the change which has increased. And so therefore there's expression about there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, the things we know we don't know, and the unknown unknowns, which are the things we don't know. This sounds complicated, but what I'm talking about really is the current world, it's accelerating. So we have disruptive technology, climate change, social unrest. In the UK, we've got Brexit, possible recession combined from a pandemic, and planning reforms all happening simultaneously. Disruptive technology itself is causing fundamental shifts in the way businesses and organizations operate, whether that's mobile internet, renewable energy, advanced materials, autonomous vehicles. All of these things can have fundamental changes to what we might consider the baseline. On top of that, the different technologies have different effects. So some of them may have a marginal effect, others may be transformational, such as artificial intelligence. So it's quite difficult for transport projects going forward to make sure that any projects that might have a life cycle of 40 to 100 years, how they consider these changes that could come about during that time. Data, we have a massive amount of data and increasing quality and quantity of data. However, it can also be overwhelming, leading to what's been described as analysis paralysis. So the data is now being driven by BIM, GIS, CAD, SIMS, visualizations, modeling, specialist software. These are being developed by multiple parties using multiple hardware and software. And the project managers and project proponents need to somehow gather, capture, and utilize and assess this information to make the best possible decisions against those objectives and targets set out before. Hence the importance actually of data management. The information undertaken at the programming stage and the planning stage from strategic environmental assessment, etc., shouldn't stop there, shouldn't be turned into a PDF and put on a shelf. That needs to go and inform the conceptual design and the design process. Further assessments, modeling and data gathered through the design process, again, shouldn't be binned at the point where permission is granted, but should be transitioned into a construction phase model so that they have access to all the prior information and data. That model should be updated through construction with as-built information, and again, be handed over properly to the operation and maintenance phase so that that team has access all the way back to the conception, programming, design, and construction information. This can then help with renovations and demolitions in the future, as well as ongoing environmental management and auditing. So key takeaway messages: there's a triple crisis and it requires a systematic, sustainable solution if we're going to manage these externalities. Strategic consideration needs to be undertaken of sustainable transport in the road, not just the highways, and the interrelationship between those modes. Future highways need to be sustainable by design, not just sustainable after the design. They need to be adaptable and resilient and future-proof to cope with the changing externalities and technologies that we can not always foresee. At the project level, sustainability needs to be tested through planning and EIA and public consultation. There are some potential calls to reduce this element within the system, and I would strongly advise against that if we're serious about achieving our sustainable development targets. Operations and maintenance should reflect the sustainability policy and strategy goals. It's no good just applying the sustainability principles in the design and construction of schemes, but everyday operations and maintenance decisions need to be updated in the light of changing policy and scientific evidence about the steps required to meet the commitments that we've made. Finally, Build Back Better needs to unlock a rapid green transition and transformation of the economy. That's all I have, but I look forward to questions and answers, which we will be having immediately after this presentation. Thank you.
No, Rufus, thank you very much for that. That was, I think, a superb presentation, and it opens up a whole range of questions and challenges, I think, for the sector, as is in common with much that's been discussed throughout the rest of the day. Now, rather than going to immediate questions and answer sessions, I understand we've got some guests from some highways consultancies that you've engaged with and work alongside. So happy for me to put you over to yourself and your colleagues to have that discussion.
Yeah, sure, George. I mean, you're welcome to join in. And really, I wanted to, rather than just myself answer any questions from the audience, I thought I'd invite two IEMA members, Chris Furno from Arup, our Highway Engineer Skill Lead, and Tim Danson, Associate for Sustainability at and Assessment, is it, Tim, at WSP. Thank you for joining us, Tim and Chris.
That's right.
Pleasure, it's a pleasure.
George, do you have any initial questions from the audience you'd like to ask us? If not, I'll turn to Tim and Chris for any initial thoughts on the presentation.
Yeah, it was an interesting one that was sort of generated was about the pace of change, because this is a recurring theme that's come up throughout the presentations to date, and it was something that you had quite a bit of emphasis on as well. And it was about how do we create adaptive structures that sort of take the factor of accelerated change into account to be able to retain flexibility in order to we address today's problems today and not yesterday's problems tomorrow. And I think it's a challenge in all aspects of it, but probably there may be some answers in some of the responses in respect to environmental policy that might actually help us understand how we can do that with tenders and contracts and the likes of that. So that was really the first question, was really how do we adapt to the pace of change? We can't build structures, contractual structures, operational structures that are inflexible. We need something far more flexible than we've had hitherto.
Sure. Well, an initial thought from myself, Chris and Tim, is that environmental assessment and sustainability in general, it's adaptive and adaptive management and dealing with uncertainty is very a key principle, I think, within our profession. And obviously, you can imagine the difference within highways. They're long-term assets. Engineering and physics principles don't tend to change. You mentioned before Isambard Kingdom Brunel being the poster boy. You can sense there a different time span perhaps within the cultures and the professions. Certainly some of the earlier speakers work on collaboration, having collaborative partnerships rather than very contractual partnerships allows you to have flexibility within contracts. The actual design of the contract can be made so that it permits change management processes and change orders without it becoming acrimonious sort of financial change orders. I mean, in EIA itself, we have this as a fundamental component. When we're predicting something that hasn't even been designed or tendered yet, we have to do what we call parameter-based assessments. So we don't say we'll definitely build this in this exact way. We give more loose parameters and use things such as worst case scenarios and Rochdale envelopes, etc., to build in that real world, practical and commercial, I won't say wriggle room, but there needs to be flexibility for unforeseen changes that will be required for the design. So I'll stop there, but Chris, thoughts on adaptability?
Yeah, I think a lot of it links back to, you mentioned sort of almost performance-based design. I think if you can set the wider context around a project in terms of the outcomes you're trying to achieve, linking back to the SDGs and other elements, that allows you to be more flexible in then how it delivers. So an example is sort of, you don't necessarily see a road as the number of cars it travels along it, but the connection it provides or the capacity it's got to move people in different forms of transport. So it's about how you focus on the outcomes and then how restrictive or prescriptive you are in the measurement of them.
Yeah, good points, Chris.
I think,
Tim?
yeah, apologies again for the background as well. It looked like I was being integrated within the matrix very, very unsuccessfully. So you have to put up with my spare room background, I'm afraid. I think for us at WSP, and we do a lot of work with highways authorities. One of the main things we look to is our Future Ready initiative, which is about understanding what future trends are in the built environment across technology, climate, resources and society. And by understanding those trends and what's material to highways projects, you can start to adapt your designs to accommodate. So designing today, but for future and tomorrow. Really good example of that is climate adaptation and drainage, where it may be that for a specific location in the UK, forecasts demonstrate that you're going to be getting a lot more precipitation, and therefore it's sensible to provide additional drainage capacity in those areas. Passive infrastructure for future services as well is something that we see, for example, from Transport for London, where big data and information is going to become more and more part of our lives on the highways, actually putting in passive infrastructure to accommodate for those things. So I think the adaptability part of that question is about knowing part of the future, and there's always some uncertainty around that, but actually getting a good general consensus on the information and using that to demonstrate how your designs have responded.
Thanks, Tim. George, do you have any other questions for us?
The need to look at transport over highways. So highways just become part of transport infrastructure rather than highways being a sort of specific piece of infrastructure in their own right. I'd be interested to know from Tim and Chris's experience, is that something that local authorities are focused on? Because local authorities primarily still have highways departments that maybe sometimes sit within community service departments or other overarching or operational departments. But are local authorities increasingly focused on transport as opposed to transport's about buses and highways is about roads? Is there a greater coming together looking at transport as an integrated element rather than those two separate? One's a service and one's an engineering concept.
Yeah. My perspective, George, sorry, is absolutely yes. And we're seeing increasing collaboration and work between highway departments and other departments. Really good example is we're currently working with Hertfordshire County Council, bringing together new guidance on how to deliver highways within Hertfordshire, taking into account local transport plan requirements, sustainable development strategy requirements, bringing in people to make decisions by consensus. So I would say it's not consistent, but it is happening because the benefits of doing that are being realised, and they help achieve all of those things that Rufus was talking about earlier in a proportionate and cost-effective way. And I also think that we're seeing a lot more focus on toolkits, data management, and actually using the resources that are out there to help quantify the improvements that are made through that collaborative approach. Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add on top of that.
I'd agree. I think the local authorities that they've linked transport in terms of roads and sort of public transport and other things, but I think they also see a massive role in how that links into place. So actually, when you've got town centres or communities, putting pure cars in a highway environment through it doesn't create the places they want, and therefore they need a much broader suite of transport solutions that balance moving people and goods around with creating places where people want to live, spend time, work, play, etc.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I really agree with that. And that's where the term transit-led development comes from. It's not just about the highway, it's about the path, the communities around it, the green spaces, how they link to other similar systems, a really systemic approach.
Supplementary to that, is that an approach about highway projects, or is it also active in respect to highway maintenance? Because there is a tendency sometimes to look at, we talked about capital projects earlier on, that to look at highways as a new project, or we've got a new road and we've got a new development and we need a new link to that development, whether that's place oriented or whatever. But actually in terms of maintenance, are they integrating maintenance activities into that concept of place and maybe changing the hierarchy or practicalities over what type of connectivity they've got? So downgrade a road to a cycle lane, or alternatively look at different methods of accessing existing housing developments. It'd be interesting to know that, because I think that starts to change the orientation of some maintenance organisations and what they see themselves as, whether they see themselves purely as about roads or whether they're actually providing solutions to transport issues. So it'd be interesting to know whether much emphasis is on maintenance as part of that integration into transport issues, not just capital projects.
From my point of view, it is. I think probably maintenance budgets are naturally tighter, and therefore their ability to do some of these is more limited. I think maintaining the maintenance part of highway authorities, I think, are becoming very aware they have an asset that has a much wider role, be it in terms of sort of social connection, or actually the role that I can do in terms of environmental benefits if it's managed and maintained in the right way. So I think they are, but I think it's probably at a slower speed than maybe sort of more of the capital enhancements, the schemes where there is more commitment to deliver something as a step change.
We haven't rehearsed this, Chris and I, but I do agree. I do agree with that as well. I think there is this growing recognition, and I think understanding of the circular economy, so understanding the capital value of the assets you have out in the environment, how to maintain and manage those with best effect, how to recover resources from them and to reuse them rather than spend money on primary resources is a big part of that role. The budgets and resource do play a big role in how successful that is, particularly in asset management plans, I think.
I came across a 4 principle in the Swedish National Roads or National Road Administration has, and their first step is measure that affects transport need and choice of transport. That's the first thing you should try and do, and if you can't do that, you then move to measures leading to more efficient utilisation of the existing road network. And then after that, you consider minor road improvements, and then after that, you consider major investments. And I think it's in a lot of the policies and the plans we use across the UK, but maybe isn't as clearly articulated as they seem to have it there.
I think perhaps it's to do with the fact that there's a lot of this is emerging thought. It might not be emerging thought in environmental development or environmental impact, but we're trying to catch up. Sort of minded to say actually we're pedaling very fast because we're not allowed to use the accelerator. But no, it's interesting, and you couldn't possibly have rehearsed the choruses when someone's only writing the song.
I think. Sorry, go on.
When you go, carry on.
I think the issue with highways for me is the same issue with energy and housing, in that we've developed it as a discipline over time in a bit of a silo. You know, you guys are in charge of highways, you study highways, you build highways, you talk about highways, and then someone else is studying electrical and designing electrical and building electrical. And, you know, and this isn't joined up by definition, it's not integrated. And I think trying to build houses without building the road and the school and the hospital is not sustainable. Trying to build a road just taking into account the benefits to the road network is not sustainable, and the same with energy, etc. So that's why, really, if you think certainly for the urban environment, we should be looking at sustainable cities or eco cities or smart cities, whatever your favoured flavour is. But the point is, you need to be looking at the role of the different modes of transport at the same time as looking at your housing need, at the same time as looking at your energy supply, so that they all connect together in a way that's maximizes efficiencies and benefits. And actually, although this sounds complicated and scary, it's really not. If you go back to that collaboration piece between, say, private and public in the case of the Suffolk example, this is a collaboration piece also, but it's between water, housing, electrical, and highways. And I think there's also massive benefits to that, in that you're not having to fund all of the money yourself and do all the work yourself, because what we want is multi-purpose assets. So instead of just building a road, and this is an example I use quite often, but in the Netherlands, if you've got a patch of seafront, what you'll probably have is a seawall with a road going through a tunnel on the other side of the seawall, with a park on the roof, a flood defence on the back, and some houses thrown in with sea views on the same bit of land. And if you took a UK example, what you'll have is a flood defence, a 50-metre gap, a road, a 50-metre gap, an overhead power line, a 50-metre gap, and then houses with a nasty view of the road and the overhead power line and a difficult route to access the beach. So I think that's what happens if you've got different organisations doing solo projects for, you know, single purposes. And we are getting better. There's flagship schemes, but I would like to see highways at the local authority level and the Highways England level thinking about an integrated approach to how can we work with all the other needs to get the best solution in the round. And
I think those solutions are much better for society and the environment as a whole. Having spent a number of years planning a bypass which actually has two dams on it to protect the village from flooding as well as removing the traffic from the village. It's not necessarily easy, but the collaboration can get you to a much better solution for all parties.
I think it's an interesting point, because I think we can discuss in the round table to follow this session. Certainly there's elements of Future Highways Research Group work that's started to work, looking at working with utility organisations to actually bring forward that mutuality, where you can get a benefit for the energy providers that actually takes a cost out of the hands of the highway maintenance departments, or the highways department, or the transport department. To move on, a comment on a question that's come in relation to small and medium-sized enterprises, actually, because we've heard a lot about promoting the role of SMEs in long-term highways maintenance, and a bigger role for SMEs in local maintenance. What incentives do you think are needed to encourage highways SMEs to become proactive in terms of sustainability? We have a tendency where we do not have a large number of visionary SMEs necessarily in relation to environmental issues, and those that are often transactional. So they offset. So we offset by planting some trees. So it's a transactional relationship rather than a reformative relationship. So they're not reforming the behaviours, they're just offsetting the behaviours. What do you think are there opportunities, and what are those opportunities to incentivise SMEs to be proactively environmentally friendly, think beyond just offsetting their environmental impact? Because that surely is the mechanism for getting organisational and functional change into maintenance activities. Anybody? Any bids?
I'm happy to go. I mean, a few things off the top of my head. I think we should be embedded sustainability into procurement. So if there's a requirement there, then that will drive behaviours. We've seen that successful in health and safety. In the educational side, you know, we've seen it with some of the highways institutes now. To become a chartered civil engineer, you now have to have a sustainability module. So there's embedding sustainability into different professions. The other thing is just explaining to the SMEs, and I'm doing some work in a different sector, but I'm doing some work with Produced in Kent with the food sector, whereby we're saying, what are the benefits of sustainability to your sector? And actually, when you get into the practical benefits of sustainable actions, it's like reducing your energy, reducing your waste. These are all actually improving your bottom line and making a more resilient organization, and therefore a more sustainable organization. So there's benefits to the SMEs from being sustainable, much wider than the winning of highways contracts, for example. Procurement can be driven by putting environmental criteria in there, and you could use things such as British standards, etc. And rewarding good behaviours as well. You know, in those collaborative partnerships and frameworks, are you acknowledging and recognising, just like a lot of contracts do on low health and safety accidents, you know, you can get rewards and bonuses for that. Are there rewards and bonuses for good environmental behaviours? We've seen that on things like Crossrail being employed successfully. I'll hand over to Chris and Tim, because I don't want to take all the time.
I think you touched on it there, Rufus. I think that there is the need to have longer term relationships with those SMEs. It's if you can have those longer term relationships where you can actually plan what the type of changes to process or the way you're going to change, and then they can see that forward workload to deliver that return into them. Sometimes it can be quite short time scales where a reasonable investment in something doesn't actually pay them a return unless they get X number of times to use it and other elements. Anything, Tim?
Yeah, I also don't think we should underplay how well this is being done in certain areas in the country. West of England Combined Authority, within their framework, they have a mandatory percentage of revenue that has to go to SMEs. We're working with SMEs in the southwest. There's a huge amount of innovation and knowledge and local experience in SMEs that we as large organisations simply don't have. And it's actually how to access that and make the best of it by clear communication and through the procurement terms that Rufus mentioned. There is lots of really good stuff going on, and huge value being added to contracts through SMEs who already know what the deal is and how to deliver sustainably. But it is a two-way conversation. There is something to be learned in both directions as well, I
think that's a very interesting point, Tim, and something I think maybe we want to follow up on to get a greater understanding of what is going on and the best practice that is being developed. because again, one of the points which highlighted earlier is how poor we are sometimes at communicating. It's actually even just having the knowledge and understanding all of these things are going on. Again, we bury ourselves in our silo at our own risk.
And I was very lucky enough to work with the Olympic Delivery Authority, and they had all those years ago, and they had a huge engagement program, buyer to buyer, supplier to buyer, where they would engage with SMEs, find out what innovations were out in the industry that they couldn't possibly know about, and actually brought those into part of the procurement process so they could tender properly. But it required that initial engagement, and we did it with the Timber Industry Federation. We did it through plastic wraps for buildings, and it brought out huge benefits on the contract in terms of carbon and materials. It was just a matter of asking the right questions to begin with.
And having the resource to be able to ask the question.
Yes, exactly.
A lot of local highway authorities maybe struggle with, but we have emerging groups within the highway sector that perhaps can take up the torch and literally the torch in respect to that one and carry it forward. Gary, have you any specifics? I've one or two more here, but.
So I didn't switch my video on before now, and you're welcome, Chris and Tim. And the only specific one I was to pull out, and it's obviously something that gets bandied around our industry and quite a lot, is in relation to microplastics and the effect of road markings on them there. And I know it's a thorny one, and I've got no axe to grind in any respect, but do you have any comment about that?
Plastics has grown hugely in terms of its visibility in the media and how organisations are expected to respond to it. I think we're still very early days, and I think some of the comments that I see are quite reactionary and maybe not grounded in science. But it is definitely something which you need to keep a tack on as part of this sustainable resource management approach. How we manage materials, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, how does tyre wear affect the release of plastics into the environment? Will autonomous vehicles and the way they are designed in terms of their weight and their impact on roads have impact on scour, and will that impact the way that plastics are released into the environment? There's still a lot of work to do to understand plastics, I think. We can't ignore it. We have to be seen to be engaging with it with our highways authorities colleagues. I feel it's a little bit early days here, and Rufus and Chris may challenge me on that, but one to watch, I think, definitely.
I think on just materials in general, Gary, and including plastics, I think of our world-class universities and our materials science laboratories and the rapid evolution of new technologies. We invented, my mind's gone blank now, the new carbon material, graphite, that was it, etc. And I just think that if you think about a lot of the traditional materials, there's also the impacts. It's not just, well, this is great for the road. It's also, there's a dirty great quarry somewhere that's getting dug out and has all its own impacts on the local community, on the wildlife, etc., from sourcing that aggregate. And then you can look at, well, can we get aggregate from the sea? What are the impacts on that? My marine colleagues will tell you all about the downsides of that. So I think that if it's not already been done, and I'm sure it is in the universities, we need a thorough review of existing and new materials and the pros and cons, both across all those aspects, the price, the material benefits of its actual durability and use, etc., but also the knock-on social and environmental impacts of acquiring that material and bringing it to site. It's not very sustainable bringing stuff down from the north of Scotland, I presume, to pave somewhere in Surrey. So all of this is in the mix, and that's where, going back to my earlier point, strategic environmental assessment should be looking at what are the best materials for roads, and there should be money going into that, and then that should feed down to the projects.
Gary, sorry, Chris, I'm just going to jump in there. So a really good example of this is Cumbria County Council. They've commissioned a really large piece of work on how they can integrate plastic polymers into asphalt as additives, and whether that really has a sustainability life cycle cost circular economy benefit. So again, in pockets it is happening, but it's how we make that, the results of that, available to all highway authorities and those interested in it, so they can adopt those good and best practice measures.
That's sort of where I was going to go, was the agility of the standards and specifications we use, that actually having the clear understanding and the clear evidence base allows us to be hopefully more agile in terms of taking bad things out of specifications or adding better things in, which at times we we can have good ideas and good materials, and we can't quite get them into use because of the processes to get them into specs.
If I can, George, a very quick point. The agency had this problem with the Environment Agency with, just as an example, there was a lock replacement. It was a tropical hardwood. It had been there for 120 years. It had to be changed. For obvious reasons, we don't want to cut down more tropical hardwood from the rainforest to replace it. So then you look at all the pros and cons of different materials. The heritage people don't want you to use plastics in a heritage lock. You then look at the temperate, sustainable hardwoods aren't up to the job in terms of a wet environment. And in the end, we talked to a specialist in timber, and they said, well, the specification for a particular type of wood, like a teak or whatever it was, is really unhelpful, because there are actually hundreds of different species that have those material properties that can survive in the wet, etc. And actually it's having that knowledge of the range of materials and the pros and the cons, which allows the procurement officers and the engineers to, rather than say, I need mahogany, for example, you say, I need a wood that can have this lifespan and these properties for submerge. That allows the market then to use innovation to find something that can meet those material requirements without you specifying a specific material.
Yeah, so it's performance-based is what you're saying, Ruth, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of aspects to that. One, it starts to bring out the VUCA principle that Rufus raised in his presentation. Is actually, we don't know what we don't know. And sometimes what appears to be a very good solution in the first instance, oh, let's all go for electric cars, they're all heavier, there's a sourcing of materials for batteries, etc., etc. So what turns out, starts off as a rush to market on a solution, can turn out to be something that we regret in the fullness of time, but that's life.
I have another vocation in life as a director of a tyre company, and they're looking forward to electric cars because they're a lot more harder on the tyres. So, and goes completely contrary to what, it adds to what you're saying, completely contrary to the whole environmental.
But how many innovations have there been in tyre materials? How long have we been using rubber for, Gary?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, we've talked about it, even in the top 5 companies, Michelin, Bridgestone, nothing at all, no innovation.
It's about incentive to innovate sometimes as well, I think, isn't
Sure.
it? Can I just, Sean, I don't know whether you're able to come to join us again. I know you're listening in the background, but I wasn't sure whether you're actually online. And if you are, if you wanted to come on and talk about the graphene trial that you did at Oxfordshire. If you're not available, that's okay. We can catch up with that.
I am. I can't start my video, unfortunately.
All right.
You're not the only one, Sean.
No, that's fine. Yeah. So the graphene trial was something that we worked with our supply chain, Skanska, with an Italian company, Interchemica, and we were the first to trial it in the UK on a live situation, as it were. It's been used in Rome on one of the main roads in Rome. And also on one of the taxiways at Rome Airport. And the idea behind it is it just does provide that durability and flexibility. So the actual strength is greatly enhanced. And the benefit of this, thank you. Maybe, no, it's still disabled it. Oh, there I am. Hello, everyone. So yeah, we work with them. It provides a more durable product, and the idea about that is that we talk about quarry material. We're talking about having to replace surfacing, maybe once every 8 years, once every 10 years. The early life testing and the lab testing for this indicated that it was, probably two or three times longer life than traditional material, and for a slightly greater investment at the start, we're all talking about whole life costing, which is pure asset management principles, which is what we should be doing. It just shows benefits. Now, that was the first in the UK that we tried it with our supplier in Oxfordshire, but it takes that first step. It's the Indiana Jones stepping out into that invisible, over the chasm when he's doing one of his tasks or whatever it is. And I think, we need more people within the industry, within, that the bravery. Let's be blunt about it. The bravery to actually do something different.
No, we seem to have lost Sean. Can I
Yeah.
leave action? Sorry.
Keep going, Sean.
So yes, early life tests, but within another 18 months we'll do some longevity tests. So we're happy to share that. I know Interchemica and Skanska will be keen to do that. But again, that's about working as a collaborative approach, not just with the supply chain, but with the materials industry, to actually take that step forward. And I was so impressed by the early life. I will be using it elsewhere in a slightly different situation, so that we do start to engage in that one. And other authorities have been very interested in it. We'll be sharing the best practice on that. But there are technical papers about it already.